morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to be here. I will have use of the microphone because it's such an interesting conversation that we had in the first panel. I would like just to recover the first line of the presentation of Anna, that as I was kindly introduced, I'm a lawyer and a political scientist, but I think I'm more lawyer than a political scientist. and Anna started her presentation with the idea of the war of conquest. The war of conquest is the key issue to understand from the legal point of view this conflict. I just want a deviation from what I want to talk about Latin America later on. The system that emerged after the Second World War with the United Nations completely prohibited that. It's not possible. We don't talk about the occupied territories in Palestine because you know it's fun to call it in that way, because basically the United Nations, the system prohibited the annexation of Israel of that part of the land. So remember that this war in Ukraine is the second part of the annexation of Crimea some years ago. So basically that's the point, that if we see it in a historical perspective, remember that after the First World War, when we created, the United Nations created a League of Nations, basically construct a system that tried to prohibit this kind of conduct. The League of Nations fails basically because it couldn't stop the annexation of Manchukuo by Japan into the Chinese mainland, and also the invasion of Italy into Ethiopia. So that when the League of Nations was not able to stop that situation, everything collapsed. And also another of the elements that was brought by Anna earlier on, the argument of the Nazi Germany said, we need to protect the Germans in other lands and, you know, the right to start to, you know, develop and to incorporate that. In this moment, we ended up in the Second World War. So I just want to take that historical perspective also from the point of view of international law, because I think it's absolutely fundamental, and that's why all the wars that are happening, answering your daughter, Yemen is not the same, because nobody in Yemen is trying to incorporate no neighboring countries. It's an internal conflict. And of course, I mean, we have plenty of internal conflict around the world, but with the exception of Armenia and Azerbaijan and the Nagorno-Karabakh area, there's very, very few discussions about international borders today. It actually was a great success of the system after the Second World War, with the exception of this, you know, old-fashioned 19th century conflict in Europe. That was the deviation as a lawyer in this talk. So going back of what you asked me to talk about the regional perspective, I would like to start with the idea that you want me to talk about the Latin American view. And of course, when we talk about Latin America, we talk about America. America is quite a concept to define, because if you ask any member of the continent, from Argentina to the Caribbean, Central America, what is America, will tell what the whole continent. But clearly in the United States, it's just with the perspective of the US. And this is one of these funny discussions that we are all Americans, but of course there is no word that can define the citizens of the United States. So when we talk about Latin America, it's more or less the same. What is Latin America? I mean, it's super difficult to define. South America is a little bit easier because it's, you know, it's something that goes south of Mexico. Even there's a huge discussion if Mexico is part of South America or not. But Latin America is a concept that for some authors include the Caribbean islands, for other countries that do not include the Caribbean islands. So the task to talk about Latin America is extremely complex for different points of view. So I will talk about Latin America in the strict senses of it. So basically the main countries in South America, not including the Caribbean in this discussion. So covering the issue of the definition and the complexities around. We have to say that Latin America, even though I'm from Venezuela, I love Latin America, I love salsa, I love tacos, I love everything in my culture, we are a peripheric area. I mean, you know, clearly we're peripheric in many sense. For example, from the economic point of view, we are just only ahead of Australia. All the big regions of the world are bigger in economic terms, But also when we compare with Russia, we need to do that comparison. Russia, in economic terms, is the same as Italy, without that, of course. I mean, when you compare Italy and Russia, has the same scale in economic terms, but of course they have nuclear weapons, and that's give the position on the world politics. But also in the size, it's very important to measure a little bit to put everything on perspective, because the size of Latin America is about 19 millions of kilometers square, about 7 million square miles. And when you compare with Russia, only with Russia, we're talking about 6 million of square miles, or around 70 million. So the whole subcontinent of Latin America is almost the same as Russia. So I think we have this problem with the Mercator projection, that we never understand exactly what is the size of the world. In a more political terms, until the 90s, last century to the 90s, in Latin America was a discussion of dictatorship versus democracy, backed by the whole discussion of the Cold War and the support of the United States foreign policy of some dictatorship as an excuse to fight against communism. And that's why, we have some dictatorships in the America that have the American support, because basically we're trying to stop the expansion of the Soviet Union at that time. That discourse disappears. Right now is a fully democratic region where the discussion is not democracy against dictatorship, is a more complex discussion between left and right. And this left and right discussion is so important in this discussion, because for many people, as we discussed last night, for many people, Putin represents the old Soviet world. For some leaders in Latin America, Putin represents the old communist dream. That, of course, is not correct. I mean, Putin is today more far right than any other people, but that helps some hinges to understand Latin America. In this moment, the democracy in the region goes from extreme right to extreme left. Okay, we have everything that you can imagine. If we go to the extreme right, we will see Bolsonaro, that is kind of a Trump brasileiro. I mean, Trump with samba. He's a former military guy that, goes. He also followed President Trump on the idea that you can cure COVID, drinking whatever you want to drink. That was from that side. And also we have a millennial guy that is the president of Salvador, Mr. Bukele, that actually adopt Bitcoin as the national currency, because we need to modernize the country, so et cetera, and say he decided to adopt the Bitcoin as a national currency. So in the middle, you have such a collection of people, very nice, very interested. For example, the new president of Chile, that actually belongs to the Communist Party. He belongs to the Communist Party. He believes in the Marxist society, but he believes in democracy at the same time. And he has been one have attacked directly Putin, saying, no, this is illegal, this is invasion, it's unacceptable, even though it comes from the Communist Party. Then we have, for example, the president of Colombia, that is a former guerrilla commander. He was the commander of the M19, one of the most important guerrilla movements in the last century, that went through pacification, and now is the president elected in Colombia, trying to promote the peace process. So when we go left and left, we ended up in a very complicated figures on the far right, the far left, sorry. That is Maduro and Ortega in Venezuela and Nicaragua, both elected by elections not recognized by the international community, but elected in that sense. So I need that explanation in order to give you how we divide the positions of the country in relation with the conflict. I will follow Professor José Antonio Sanauja, he's an alumni of UPEACE, and about the classification of the country. He divided in four groups. One group of countries that, with no doubt, condemn the invasion. Say, no discussion, this is an illegal invasion, forget about it, we will not discuss it. That is the majority of the countries, basically the Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Peru, Chile, etc. There are two very important countries that try to appear internationally as neutrals and say, no, this is a very complex situation. That is basically the two biggest economies in South America, Brazil and Argentina. Say, no, that's not that bad. I mean, this is a European conflict, etc. But they condemn at the Organization of American States and at the United Nations the invasion. So the rhetoric on one side, but the support against the invasion was the other side. The third group, and it's only one country, is El Salvador, with the President Bukele, with the idea of this Bitcoin, etc. Even though he's very far right, the United States have been very critical of the government, not supporting his policy. So in order to bother the United States, President Bukele decided not to condemn directly the invasion and play the neutrality, even though he does not support the invasion. He's not condemning international basically as a way to be outside of the consensus in the region. And last but not least, we have 4 states that do not condemn and actually support the invasion, support Putin's position on the war in Ukraine. They basically are Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia. That basically they take the discourse that is the fall of the United States. They join the driver of commander on and about that is everything fall of the United States, and that is the far left of the country. But why that situation? Why we have that variety of positions? So basically, there are some elements that I would like to. First of all, a great expansion of the Russian foreign policy in the region. Believe it or not, the Sputnik vaccine of the Russians arrived first in the majority of these countries that are supporting right now. And so they are paying back the favor. Okay, I received the Sputnik vaccine. I have to support you because it's very important during the pandemic. Also, for Argentina and Brazil, more than 60% of the fertilizer that they use in the huge agricultural industry comes from Russia, and it's very, very important. And last but not least, the financial support that Russia provides to these countries that always have in economic situation. But why we have this expansion of Russia there? Basically for a retreat, very conservative, you can name it in different ways, of the American foreign policy. The American foreign policy only sees the region from a security point of view, when basically the issue of migration is on the top of the agenda, leaving, the region for something, only provided of migrants, leaving this concept that, in a second level, has been an area abandoned by the American foreign policy for many decades, and this is a result of that. If you abandon an area, you will have new actors on that. And a part of Russia, clearly China. China is, the new actor, providing all the economic support, and is the new part. So to conclude on some regards about this. First of all, we can see that there is a huge lack of consensus on the region around this. The topic is perceived as an European conflict, something that these people are fighting that will not affect what happened in Latin America. They will not affect the relation between the United States and Latin America. So it's an European problem. Let's leave it there. In the case of the regional agenda, the local agenda supersedes the global agenda. For Latin Americans, it's more important our own discussion between democracy and freedom, left and right, than what happened in Russia and Europe. So for us, something that we watch on the news, that we discuss, and then you will have your own opinion based on your own political assumptions. So if you belong to the left, you will say something. If you belong to the right, you will say whatever. Even though these different approaches into the conflict, the different positions, no country in Latin America has changed the relations with Russia. No break of diplomatic relations. The imposition of sanctions has been very complicated. Well, let's not do it by New York. We can do it somewhere else. So it's a very, very, how we call it, practical approach. Again, it's an European conflict. Who cares? Let's manage the problem from our own point. And clearly, to conclude, there is no homogeneous or clear response to the war. is based on our own regional agendas. That's what I would like to point out about the Latin American response. Thank you very much.
Thank you.